Talking to Wayne's all day is actually pretty bad, but not half as scary as doing this. The Immortal Memory, I'm just really going to try and say a few words about Robbie Burns, put him maybe in the context of his time, and maybe just talk about why I think his poetry still matters and why, particularly for people who are looking to change the world, then he is an important figure. But I'm going to start off quoting a poem, but funnily enough, not one by Robert Burns. He was a contemporary of Burns, he was a fan of Burns, he visited his grave after he'd died, and it's William Wordsworth, and he said, bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. And that's a reference to the electric shock, really, that went through across the world in 1789 when you had the French Revolution, where you saw one of the monastic dynasties of Europe toppled by, you know, the poor of the slums of Paris and the poor of France. And it absolutely electrified people across the world. And Wordsworth obviously felt alive like he hadn't before because of what was happening. And we tend to think of Wordsworth as being what we call one of the romantic poets. And we think of romantic poetry, we tend to think of somebody wandering through, you know, the daffodils lonely as a cloud, which is a perfectly honourable thing to do. But what we now know as romanticism was really an artistic and intellectual response to what was an era of revolution and counter-revolution. We think about in 1819, this was after Burns' death, but obviously he influenced this, the kind of second generation of the romantic poets, like Shelley, who obviously in response to the Peterloo massacre writes his Mask of Anarchy with the famous closing remarks about rising like lions and how we are many, they are few. And similarly, even Beethoven, his Third Symphony, he originally dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte because he thought he summed up the kind of the ideals of the revolution, only to literally score out his name for the manuscript when Napoleon declares himself as emperor, because he sees that as a betrayal of what the ideals of the French Revolution were all about. And so the context at this time was it was really time for picking sides. And it's probably fair to say, given the nature of tonight's event, that Burns certainly picked the sides of radical change, of democracy, of opposition to monarchy and feudal power. It's maybe hard to imagine just now when we look at the American Empire and we see people jumping about the Capitol building, you know, saying that we need another revolution and in effect, I mean a counter-revolution. But for example, Burns wrote a poem called Ode to George Washington. And again, he's a problematic figure for us now. But for the radicals of their time, then the American Revolution really was seen as striking a blow against monarchy, was seen as striking a blow against empire, I suppose, you know, the development of the British Empire. And interestingly, this poem, which, you know, celebrated the American Revolution, wasn't actually fully published until 1859. And that was in America. And part of the reason for that is that Burns in his own lifetime was frightened by, you know, the reaction of the state to these revolutionary movements. People could lose their livelihood, people could be jailed, people could be exiled. And therefore a lot of his more political poetry actually we didn't come across it till after his death. And sometimes actually it was, you know, anonymous. It was published anonymously because of the fear of retribution that it might bring. And I think that was the case with probably one of his most famous songs and poems, which is A Man's a Man for All That, is, you know. And this is really kind of hymn, I suppose, to human solidarity, a hymn to, you know, ordinary people against the power of the rich and the powerful. And it says, the honest man, though earthly poor, is king a man for all that. And it's just a dead simple but profound idea here that he's talking about, which is that you judge people on who they are, not on their rank. You know, echoes Martin Luther King's comment about judging people with the content of their character, not the colour of their skin. Well, in this case, Burns is saying it doesn't matter if you're a peasant, if you're a worker, or you're an aristocrat, we'll judge you on the basis of the sort of person that you are, which when you think about it, still is and remains quite a radical and revolutionary idea. And then he goes on to say, see yon bunky cad a lord, who struts and stares for all that, 200 worship at his feet, he but a coof for all that. And you see there that kind of the contempt with which Burns is holding the aristocracy, the rulers of their time. And he's doing it with humour. He's doing it with a bit of sarcasm. To some extent, he's really just taking the piss out to puncture the pomposity and the pretentiousness of the powerful. And I think for me, that's one of the most powerful elements of Burns, if you read his writings, that he takes no prisoners in terms of how he mocks the rich and mocks their pretensions. And that kind of democratic sentiment, I suppose, which is reflected in Burns's lines, was also reflected in his choice, what he chose for his poetic language, because he chose to use the Scots, or those that he lived with and grew up with. He spent part of his time recording, going around and taking a record of the songs and the stories of working people up and down Scotland. And actually, if you think about that in itself, is quite a revolutionary artistic statement, because normally the arts, culture, literature is, particularly then, was seen as a preserver of the rich. You had to speak in a certain language, you had to follow certain conventions, and yet Burns wasn't interested in that. He wanted to reflect what he thought, and he wanted to reflect the life of the people round about him. And yet I suppose part of what he did so successfully is from that kind of very particular way of writing, his particular experiences and his particular background, then he managed to address, I suppose, what you could call the universal, some of the universal themes, ideas and problems faced by humanity. And that's probably why his work prevails to this day, and we're having events like this tonight. And one of the most famous of his songs, again, is a song called The Slave's Lament, which is a song that charts the journey of a slave stolen from his home in Guyana, ended up in Virginia, working in the tobacco plantation there. The burden I must bear, well, the cruel scourge I fear in the lands of Virginia. And I think in friends most dear, with the bitter, bitter tear. And that poem and that song prompted the famous African-American poet Maya Angelou to make a comment about how Burns, for her, was the first white man that she read who seemed to understand that a human being was a human being and that we're more alike than unlike. Again, a really profound statement and a real recognition of Burns's humanity and how it kind of, I suppose, spoke to everybody, whatever their background, and that's why he's celebrated across the world. And that kind of profundity of thought, I think, is reflected even some of his shorter poems. I mean, obviously, as a teacher, I try, the operative word's often been trying to teach Burns to the kids, and even some of the simpler and shorter poems like To a Mouse contain real insights into the human condition, I suppose. And there's a line, I'm truly sorry, man's dominion has broken nature's social union, which is, again, thinking about the relationship of human beings to nature, the damage that human beings can do to nature, which is something that's just really, really current, obviously, as we face kind of environmental crisis in the globe. And it was a theme at that time. I mentioned again about the Romantic poets, and that was a real theme, man's relationship to nature. And it was a theme that ran through Burns' work. But it's fair to say that it was a very, very earthy approach that Burns took. It was much more grounded, much more down to earth than maybe some of the other poets that addressed that. And part of the reason was because he worked a farm. He worked as a farmer, he worked the soil. And that affinity came from that kind of labour that he had to carry out, very harsh, very physical labour, which, they do reckon may have contributed to his early death. And even when you think of the most famous lines of that poem, it talks about how the best laid schemes of mice and men going after Gley. And that, again, it really reflects on this idea about how contingent life can be. We're at the mercy very often of external forces, however much we think that we've got control of what's taking place. And I think it couldn't be more apt, obviously, from 2020 and 2021, as we struggle through this particular pandemic. But although he was universal, Burns is also about place and about voice, as I mentioned. And it's also, and that is important because it is still about whose voices are heard, who gets to say things, be it in literature, be it in the media, be it in politics. In 1994, as recently as that, James Kelman won the Booker Prize with a book called How Late It Was, How Late. And anybody that's read it, it's an internal monologue of a Glaswegian And his victory caused absolute uproar, controversy. Somebody described him as an illiterate savage because he chose to write in the voice of a working class Scot. And I think that remains now an issue, and it remains, you know, an issue in terms of, for me as a socialist, how do I make sure that my voice and the voice of other working class people are heard? And it's also about, Burns is also about place in the sense that he has made a massive contribution to Scottish literature and Scotland's sense of itself. The theorist Benedict Anderson talked about the idea of our imagined communities, the idea that a shared culture, it's not just about a physical space that we share, it's about a shared culture, which can bring a common outlook and a common sense of direction and purpose for us. And nobody played as big a part in that in terms of Scotland as Robert Burns did. And as I say, he did it consciously by going out and at times collecting the stories that otherwise would have been lost through time. And I think as we're on the cusp possibly of creating a different type of Scotland, that kind of engagement with our culture, what culture can bring, how culture can challenge the establishment is something that's really important, because we want to create a Scotland that, in Burns' words, rejects the Guinness stamp of hierarchy and power. So in the next programme, we're going to hear our humanity reflected back at us. We'll hear about our loves, our losses, our joy and our determination. And we'll also hear working class voices express our hopes and our, wishes to see a better world and to improve the circumstances of ourselves and the people that are round about us. And we'll try to find a language to do that that's meaningful to us and to the people round about us. And for me, as somebody who's been involved, like Rosie says, in socialist politics for a long time, that's for me one of the big lessons of Robert Burns' life and his ideas. So I don't know if I'm meant to do this, I don't know the actual procedures, but I'm going to ask you, if you're all out there, to raise a glass to Robert Burns, to radicalism, and dare I say it, to revolution. Thanks very much.